Nowadays, it often seems like the traditional approach to justice isn't working. People who are convicted of crimes go to prison, but when they're released, they often commit the same or worse crimes all over again. Today, we're going to hear about an alternative to prison for dealing with crime. It's called restorative justice. My guest is Robert Sherman. Welcome to the program.
Well, thank you.
First of all, what is restorative justice?
Well, it's a different way of dealing with crime. The word restorative comes from the verb to restore, and the aim of restorative justice is to restore those who have been injured, to make things right for the victim and for the community. So rather than focusing on the offender and on, punishing him or her, restorative justice focuses on the crime. What was done, who was hurt by it, how can we make it right? And then we get the offender involved in making it right, both for the victim and for the community.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Let's say, for example, a couple of young guys go out one night and go crazy. They break into cars, throw rocks through windows, and cause a lot of damage. They are arrested and they plead guilty. But here's the important point. Instead of going to prison, the boys meet with the victims of the damage face to face. They meet the people whose cars and property they destroyed. They have to apologize to each victim and offer to do what they can to repair the damage. For example, they might have to work for a time to pay for the broken windows.
That's a real old-fashioned way to deal with crime, isn't it? It's like what my parents would have done.
Yes, it is. The main thing is to help the offender realize what he did and to take responsibility for causing it. And this is really important, particularly with young people. Many people working with young offenders will say this: they just don't feel any responsibility.
Now, what about the victims? How does participating in the restorative justice process affect them?
It's often a positive experience because it allows them to give their side of the story. In particular, it often helps victims feel less afraid. It helps to meet the offender or offenders, to put a human face on it.
And does this kind of approach help to reduce crime? Does it stop people from committing crimes again?
It seems to, yes. There's research that shows that restorative justice is often more effective than the traditional court process, particularly with young offenders. They are less likely to repeat the crime, and if they do get in trouble again, their crimes are less serious.
Now, is restorative justice only used in the United States? Is it an American thing?
Oh, no. There are different kinds of programs in different countries all over the world. One interesting point is that in some places, restorative justice programs are based on traditional systems that the people have always used. Like, for example, in New Zealand. They're using a program called community group conferencing. That's something that the Maori people, the original inhabitants of New Zealand, have used for years.
Really?
Yes. Native Americans also had a similar way of dealing with crime. So although it's a new movement, it's got old roots.
All right. Well, when we come back, we'll be taking some calls from listeners, and the number to call is...
Hello, and welcome to It's the Law, the show where listeners call in with legal questions. The number to call is 1-800-563-2677. Now let's hear from our first caller, Patty of Santa Barbara, California. Patty, you're on the line.
Yes, I have a problem. I was walking past my neighbor's house a few months ago, and there was a bunch of stuff put out on the sidewalk in front of the house on the curb with the trash. Free stuff. I saw a piece of art that I liked, and it was in good condition, so I picked it up and took it home. It was an oil painting, a seascape, and it was signed.
Okay, go on.
Well, a few weeks later, I showed it to a friend who knows something about art, and he saw the signature, and he said, "Wait a minute, this was painted by Walter Mitchell." I did some research, and apparently the artist is famous, and the painting could be worth about as much as $10,000.
Wow.
So my question is, did I steal this painting? I mean, they threw it out, but now I know it's worth something, and I'm worried about it.
And so you want to know if you're breaking the law by keeping it. Okay, let's ask our legal expert here, Sarah Cole. Sarah, what do you think?
Well, I think there's an ethical question here, but there's no legal issue. Legally, you can keep the painting as long as it was definitely thrown away by the owners. You're saying it was in the trash.
Not in the trash, no, but it was next to the trash with a bunch of other stuff, old furniture and junk. If no one had taken it, the trash collectors would have thrown it in the garbage truck.
Looks like you were very lucky.
But wait a minute, you said there was an ethical question?
Well, I do think there's an ethical aspect here, and that is, you know who the original owners are, so you could give the painting back to them.
But they threw it away. They didn't want it.
Yes, but do you think they knew what it was worth? And do you think they would have thrown it out if they knew what it was worth?
I see your point.
So, legally, the painting is now Patty's, but ethically, I think the right thing to do would be to return the picture, but it's up to Patty.
So it's up to you, Patty. Not an easy decision to make.
No, it's not easy at all, but thank you for the help.
All right. Andrew from Portland, Maine is on the line. Andrew?
Yes, I have a problem. I'm renting a house with 2 floors, and there's a hole in the staircase.
A hole in the staircase. Indoors or outdoors?
It's indoors, going up to the 2nd floor.
How big is it?
Not very big, but you could put your foot through it if you didn't know it was there. I mean, we walk around it, but I'm worried that if we have guests and someone doesn't know about it...
So if someone gets hurt, would Andrew be held liable? I mean, would he be responsible for the injury?
Well, there are definitely liability issues here. Have you told the landlord about the hole?
Yes, I've talked to him about it.
How long ago did you tell him? And did you put it in writing?
I'd say it was about a month ago, but not in writing, no. I just told him about it.
Okay. I'd say, well, here's one thing you can do. You need to put up a warning sign on the stairs so that people know to go around the hole. You are legally obligated to warn visitors of dangers such as holes in stairs or broken windows or whatever.
Okay.
And then you need to notify your landlord again, this time in writing. Tell him what you've told me, and mention that you are worried about liability. You don't want to be held responsible if someone gets injured.
Whose liability is it?
If the landlord was clearly told about the hole and hasn't done anything about it, then he is liable. You could be held liable if the landlord claims you never told him about it, or if someone says they weren't warned.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
That's all we have time for today. Next week, we'd look at consumer law. What happens when you buy?
This is Pat Lee, and you're listening to Math World. Now, here's a question. Can you guess how hand, the petals of certain kinds of flowers, even some famous paintings, are related mathematically? Well, if you have no idea, our question of the day, Lucy Warwick in Rhode Island, will help you. Ms. Warwick asks, I've heard a lot about the Fibonacci sequence lately. What exactly is it? For an answer, we contacted Professor of Mathematics, Dr. James Quist. Hello, Dr. Quist. Can you tell us a little about the Fibonacci sequence to answer Ms. Warwick's question?
Well, that's a great question, especially since the sequence is around us in so many forms, and many people have no idea about it. It's really very intriguing once you're aware of it. First, what the sequence is. It's a series of numbers, and in the sequence, each number is the sum of the preceding 2 numbers. In other words, you add 2 numbers together to get the next one. Let's look at the start of it. The numbers are 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, and 8. So, if we add the first 2 numbers, 1 and 1, we get 2, which is the third number. Then 1 and 2 equal 3, which is the fourth number. Then 2 and 3 equal 5, which is the fifth number, and so it continues.
So, let's see. Each number is the sum of the previous 2 numbers. And the sequence can just go on and on?
Yes, that's right. And what's so amazing about this is that the sequence shows up around us in so many ways. It appears in the natural world. Natural forms tend to reproduce the sequence. For example, flowers, pine cones, or seashells. Look at the petals on a flower. They are more likely to be 5 petals than 4. The spirals in a seashell also involve numbers from the sequence. It's not as easy to see as with flowers, but the measurements of the spiral are numbers of the sequence. Some people even mention the human hand when talking about the sequence. We have 2 hands. Each of these has five fingers, and each finger has 3 parts separated by 2 knuckles. All of these are numbers in the sequence. Maybe it's just a coincidence, or maybe not. And it's not just in the natural world, it's also in the art world. It appears in a lot of art. Probably the most famous is the work of Leonardo da Vinci. You see a lot of spirals in his painting, and spirals are the form most associated with the Fibonacci sequence. It also appears in music. One of Bach's pieces is based on this sequence in the way the musical patterns repeat. Now, it's not clear whether Bach did this consciously or not.
Interesting. Who discovered all this?
It was discovered by a mathematician in Italy in the early 1200s. His name was Leonardo of Pisa. But he called himself Fibonacci because his father's name was Bonacci. Anyway, he was an extraordinary mathematician. He actually introduced the decimal system to other mathematicians of the time.
So mathematicians have known about the sequence for a long time.
Yes. Now, your listener says that she's heard a lot lately about the Fibonacci sequence. It seems like interest in this area kind of comes and goes in popularity. Lately, it has been more popular. I think it's great. It's fascinating, and if it gets people interested in math and numbers, then all the better.
It is fascinating. Thank you so much, Dr. Quist.
You're welcome.
Okay. So that's some history in the development of the computer. Next week we'll be talking about chapters 10 and 11 in your book, so please read those. Are there any questions? Yes.
Thanks. I know that this might not be part of this class, but I'm just wondering about before we had computers, it seems like people must still have needed to calculate things. How did they do it before we had computers?
That's an excellent question, and I'm happy to answer it. It's so interesting. Most of us don't even remember what life was like before computers and technology became such a part of everyday life. Computers have been with us for so long now that many people, unfortunately not me, are just too young to have experienced life before computers. And many of us who are older have simply forgotten what it was like. But yes, indeed, humans had to work out large calculations before computers. Think of all the progress made in astronomy, for example. How did they do it? Well, people did it. Before computers, people did the computing. They were human computers. People whose job it was to do large calculations. An early example of human computers was in the mid-1700s. A scientist wanted to make a mathematical model of the orbit of Halley's Comet. You've heard of Halley's Comet, right? Anyway, this scientist got 2 of his friends to help him, and they worked together doing calculations for 5 months to make a mathematical model of the orbit of the comet. This is an early example of human computing. Now, an interesting aspect of this is that people quickly realized that dividing the work, division of labor, and specializing in different tasks was really important. They just couldn't do the work otherwise. For example, a French civil engineer who lived in the late 1700s and early 1800s wanted to prepare 19 volumes, so that's 19 books, of mathematical tables. He started with a small group of mathematicians, and they divided the work into a series of different tasks. Then he hired, 80 human computers to do the work. It still took 6 years to complete the work, but they got it done because they divided the work up. Another example of the work the human computers did was in the First World War. Actually, they were used in both the First and Second World Wars. Both sides in the war used human computers. They used them to do calculations for maps and weapons. Now, you're probably thinking of these human computers and imagining that they were all talented and very good at mathematics. One of the things that I find most interesting about this is that most of them were not at all experts in math. Many of them only had basic skills. A lot of them were very poor and unable to find other work. Also, some of you might be surprised to learn that a lot of the human computers were women. In fact, one of the group of 3 who calculated the orbit of Halley's Comet that I mentioned earlier, well, one of the members of that group was a woman. So women were very much a part of this work. If you find this topic interesting, I'd recommend a book called When Computers Were Human by, let me see, yes, it's Greer, David Alan Greer.
Could you repeat that, please?
Yes, of course. The title is When Computers Were Human, and the author is David Alan Greer. The book talks about all the examples I've given and more, and it's fascinating. He actually got into this topic because he found out completely by chance that his grandmother had gone to college around 1920 and received a degree in mathematics. No one in the family knew about this, so he started doing research, and that's how he got into writing the book. Oh, we're definitely out of time. I'll be around for a few minutes if there are questions. Otherwise, see you next week.
Hi.
Hey.
Are you working on something?
Yeah, preparing for a presentation for my history class.
What's it about?
It's about the different people that discovered America.
I thought Christopher Columbus discovered America.
Well...
In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue.
Yeah, well, he did, but it turns out that Columbus wasn't the first person to get to the New World at all.
Was he the first European?
Nope, not even that.
Really? Sorry, I didn't mean to disturb you. Do you want to work? I'll go.
No, actually, it's okay. Actually, do you mind if I go over the presentation with you? It would help a lot.
Oh, sure, no problem. Sounds really interesting.
Well, my first point is that Europeans didn't really discover America anyway. The Native Americans were already here. So if anyone really discovered America, it was them.
But then where did they come from?
I'll explain. It seems that the very first people to come to the American continent came from Asia, across the Bering Strait. They came in from the north and moved down the American continent, all the way down to South America. Those people became the Native Americans, and the Aztecs, and the Mayans, and the Incas.
Really? I didn't know that.
Well, that was in prehistory, a long, long time ago. But then I'm going to talk about some of the other explorers who reached the New World before Columbus did.
I see.
I'm going to talk about 2 of them in particular.
Okay.
Well, Leif Erikson was the most famous. He was a Viking, probably from Norway. He colonized Greenland, and then sometime in the 10th century, he sailed from the southern tip of Greenland to Newfoundland 500 years before Columbus. There are remains of a Viking settlement there. In Newfoundland, I mean. And what's interesting is Leif Erikson went to the New World because he'd heard stories about it. So it seems like people did know, or at least they suspected, that there was land there, even as early as the 10th century. In all of the Western European countries, there were lots of myths and stories about land in the West. It's understandable, really, because take Newfoundland, for example. It's not all that far from Western Europe.
I never realized that, but it makes sense.
But then, apart from the Western Europeans, there was the Chinese.
The Chinese? Really?
Yeah. The most famous Chinese explorer was Zheng He. He was a very powerful commander in the Chinese army during the Ming Dynasty. It was the golden age of Chinese exploration, the early 1400s. The Chinese had these beautiful treasure ships. They were huge, much larger and way more sophisticated than anything in Europe at that time. About 10 times the size of Columbus's ships. In one expedition, they had like 300 ships and 28,000 men. Zheng Hao was in charge. He went all over the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, the Persian Gulf, Africa, opening up trade and taking treasure from different places.
Really?
Yeah, it seems that he might have reached Australia as well. And, well, some people believe that he got to America in 1421, well before Columbus.
Wow, that's really interesting. Sounds like a good presentation.
Thank you. I need to get some pictures.
Our presentation is about Ellis Island. We went there last week and took a tour, and we're going to describe some of the things that we found out. First, Grace and I'll talk about the process, what it was like for immigrants to go through Ellis Island, and then Melissa's going to talk about her family's experience doing research into her background. Okay? So, let's go to Grace first.
Hi. I'm going to talk about the first part of the process of going through Ellis Island, the different stages that the immigrants had to go through. Okay, first, one important thing to remember is that Ellis Island was only used for the poorest immigrants, the third-class passengers. The first and second-class passengers were processed on the ship. Then they were taken to the docks, where they got off, and then the ship would sail on to Ellis Island, with the third-class passengers still on board. When they finally landed at Ellis Island, they'd put on all the clothes they owned because they were allowed to bring in only one bag with their possessions from the old country. People brought in all kinds of things, like you would see musical instruments or samovars, pots for making tea. Some people brought earth from the old country too, or plants, vines for example, for growing grapes. Then the first place they got to was the dining hall, where they were given a meal that it was paid for by the steamship companies. People who came through Ellis Island always remember the meal. The food was apparently quite good, but it was also strange for many of them. Some people had never tasted ice cream or seen an orange or a banana, for example. And then after that, the inspections began, and Arnie is going to tell you about that part. Arnie?
Thank you. Okay. After the meal, the passengers would leave their bags and go up a staircase to the Great Hall. And as they walked past, inspectors would watch them carefully to see if they were weak or sick. If someone was sick, they would send them to the hospital. There was a hospital on Ellis Island as well, until they got better. They also detained children, young women, and old people traveling alone. About 20% of people were held back, often for health reasons, but most were released after a day or two, or when someone came to pick them up. In the Great Hall, they waited in line for hours, sometimes as long as 5 hours. They were crowded together, and it was often very hot and very loud, you can imagine. As many as 2,000 people, all talking in so many languages. Then, when they finally got to the top of the line, the inspectors asked them questions like, "Where do you come from? Where are you going? Is somebody waiting for you?" That kind of thing. And there were social workers and interpreters waiting with the inspectors, like helping people who needed to locate relatives or whatever. Once they got past that part, the questions, people would go into one of 3 lanes behind the inspectors. The first lane was for the detention center if you were being held back. The second lane was for the railroad ticket office for the train station. And the third lane was down the stairs to the area where people were waiting. There was a post there that was called the kissing post, because that was the scene of so many reunions. Husbands met their wives and fathers met their children they hadn't seen in years, and then the immigrants went off to start a new life. So now I'm going to let Melissa talk about her family's experience tracing their ancestors.
Well, my great-grandfather came in from Ireland, and my Aunt Joan actually used Ellis Island records to do research and find out where he came from. So I'm going to talk a bit about that. Basically, what they have at Ellis Island is the ship's records and the immigration information of every arriving passenger with, like, the date that they came in, their age, and the town they came from. So, if you know, for example, your ancestor's name, the year they arrived, or where he or she came from, you can look them up. So that's what we did. My Aunt Joan wanted to know more about her grandfather. My great-grandfather. He died before I was born, but apparently he was a great musician. He'd play the fiddle and sing at family events. Well, Joan knew that he'd come from Cork in Ireland, but she didn't know where in Cork because he never spoke about it. So Joan went to the Ellis Island records, and she found my great-grandfather's name, and it gave the name of the town that he came from. So she went to Ireland and visited the town a couple of years ago. She got more information when she was there, and eventually she found a living relative, a cousin, that she didn't know she had. It was great because she'd always wanted to know more about where their grandfather had come from.
So, that's all we have time for, but we hope that you enjoyed our presentation. Thank you.
Well, here's an interesting story. Have you ever been caught in a rainstorm without an umbrella and wondered how to stay driest? Should you run or should you walk through the rain?
You mean like if I'm in a parking lot, it's raining, and I have to get to the building, will I get less wet if I run versus if I walk?
Yes, that's right.
Now, I've always thought it made more sense to run.
Well, that seems to make sense. It seems like if you're out in the rain for a longer period of time because you're walking, you'll get wetter. But it's a little more complicated. When you run, rain hits the front of your body more, so then you have to calculate how much of your body is exposed and for how much time.
I guess it is more complicated than it seems at first.
And then there's wind. If it's windy, it seems like that would make a difference.
I hadn't thought of that. If the wind is blowing rain at you, then you'd probably get wetter.
Well, some scientists have spent a lot of time on this question, and they finally have an answer. If you run in light rain without a lot of wind, you stay, 16% drier.
Only 16%? I expected more benefit. Maybe it isn't worth the effort of running.
Maybe not. But there's more benefit to running if it's a heavy rain, especially with a lot of wind. In those conditions, you stay 40 to 44% drier if you run.
Okay, that's better. So it's worth running when it's windy.
Yes, and when the rain is heavy.
What I want to know is, how did they do this research?
Well, at first they did equations to calculate the different conditions in a rainstorm. Scientists worked it out mathematically. But then two scientists in North Carolina decided to actually do an experiment. First, they went out and bought identical clothes, shirts, pants, hats. Then they measured out a 100-meter track outside their office building and waited for a rainstorm. When there was finally a good rainstorm with wind, they went out and one man walked around the track while the other ran. After they finished, they weighed the clothes to find out how much water had been absorbed. And they found that the person who ran got less wet. His clothes were 40% drier. You know, the two scientists actually say that the experiment was kind of a joke. They weren't really taking it seriously, but in the end, other people were interested in the results.
That's interesting. Of course, if you just carry an umbrella, you wouldn't have to think about any of this.
Yes, but who always remembers an umbrella?
Good morning and welcome. It's the final day of our conference on water issues around the world. In the past 3 days, we've heard many lectures on water and its effect on all of our lives, the importance of water, issues with water use, problems with availability of water, and so on. There's been a lot to consider. This morning, our speaker is Dr. Regina Garcia. Dr. Garcia has overseen many successful water projects around the world. She's going to tell us about a few interesting projects that are going on right now, and then she will take some of your questions. Welcome, Dr. Garcia.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here today. This conference has offered an incredible opportunity for concerned people to meet and exchange ideas on these important issues. There are many positive water projects in progress around the world. I'm going to start with a quick overview of a few examples, and then later we'll consider them in detail. The first is here in the United States, near El Paso, Texas, in a small town called San Elizario. San Elizario is a very poor town, and until just recently, the residents did not have a water system in the town. So water for drinking, cooking, and toilets was difficult to get. A family might typically have 2 buckets of water a day to use. This was for the entire family and would be used for both cooking and washing. The water authorities had told the town repeatedly that water and sewage systems would be installed, but it never happened. Finally, the women of the town had enough, and they decided to do something about the problem. They got together and built a water system for themselves. Obviously, they had to learn as they went along, but they built things themselves and raised the money throughout the project, and they did it. The lives of the families in San Elizario have changed enormously because they now have enough water for everyday activities. People from nearby towns that still don't have water systems have visited the town to get ideas about how they might set up something similar. This is a real success story. Another example of a successful project is in India, in the city of Calcutta. Now, Calcutta is one of the most populated and polluted areas in India. But on the edge of the city there are some large ponds of sparkling water called the Calcutta wetlands. These wetlands are made from the wastewater of the city. The water is not clean enough to drink, but it is clean enough for fish to live in, and the fish provide food for people. The wetlands also offer some natural scenery in the city. So how can dirty water, waste from the city, end up as pond water that is healthy enough for fish to live in? Well, it all has to do with algae. You know, seaweed and tiny plants that live in the water. The algae actually eat the waste. So eventually the water is changed into cleaner water that fish can live in. The person who figured out how this works and developed the project believes that this simple water cleaning system could be used in other places. There is no expensive technology involved. It's just a matter of understanding the ecosystem and helping it along. So this fairly simple system of cleaning dirty water could potentially be used anywhere in the world. The last example is of a simple program in the city of Vancouver in British Columbia, Canada. There, the city has designed and manufactured rain barrels for residents of the city. The residents use the rain barrels to collect water to water their gardens. Now, this may not seem like a particularly important project. Vancouver is a city that gets a lot of rain after all. But I believe it is indeed important. The main idea behind this program is to try to make people more aware of wasteful water practices. Historically, people didn't feel that water conservation was important, since the city does in fact get a lot of rain. But people use a lot of water to irrigate their gardens during the summer. So the city hopes that this simple program will make people think a bit more about water use. I think this type of program, where people in places that don't appear to have major water problems also learn about water conservation, is becoming more important in worldwide education about water use. Now, I'll take a minute to answer any questions so far before we go into these programs in detail.
According to sociologists, American society has changed dramatically over the last 2 generations. Statistics show that we are much less involved in our communities than we used to be. And here to discuss what this might mean for our society is sociologist David Lee. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
First of all, can you summarize the issue for us?
Well, as you say, Americans in the United States, they are less involved in their communities than they were in, say, 1960. There's less participation all around. We get together a lot less, even with friends.
Can you give us some examples?
Well, one statistic that comes up a lot is membership in the PTA, the National Parent-Teacher Association. In the 1950s, almost half of parents with children under 18 were members of the PTA. They got together and attended meetings and raised money for their children's schools. Well, membership in the PTA went from 50% in the 50s to under 20% in 1995. And that's just one example. The number of people who attend other kinds of public meetings about local affairs, such as, improving bus service or crime in the neighborhood, has gone down by about 60%.
It's like people are less interested in the community.
Yes, that's what it looks like. There's less interest in the political process as well. Look at newspaper readership, for example. Only about 25% of people aged 40 and under read a newspaper every day. That contrasts with 80% of older Americans. That's a big difference.
It sure is. And what about the number of people that vote? That's down too, isn't it?
Yes, voting is a really very basic measure of political participation. And voting is way down. At the turn of the century, the last century, so in 1900, about 85% of eligible adults turned out to vote. In the last presidential election, less than 50% turned out.
Yeah, I see the problem. But you're talking about political involvement and involvement in local organizations. But what about our social lives? You mentioned that we socialize less as well?
Yes, we socialize less than we used to. In the 1950s, people had friends over to dinner more often. They visited their neighbors more often. Generally, people seem to have a much better social life back then than they do now.
That's really interesting. So we're becoming more isolated from each other.
Yes.
But is this such a big deal? You might say, so what? Are these kinds of social connections between people really important? These days we have the telephone, we have the internet.
Yes, the telephone has replaced face-to-face contact a lot, but informal social connections are actually very important.
Why?
There's a high correlation between social connections in a community and crime, for example. The more people know one another's name in a community, the less crime there is.
I suppose that makes sense. Everybody knows who you are.
Yep. And people living in communities where there are a lot of social connections tend to live longer. They have better health, and they're generally happier.
Wow. So I guess there is a need to make people feel more connected to their communities. But how would you do that?
That's the million-dollar question. Well, one way would be to encourage people to volunteer more. Volunteering is a great way to get involved in the world around you and build connections with other people.
Maybe we should all just hold block parties and get to know our neighbors.
Absolutely. Why not?
Hi, we're doing some research on social involvement. We want to find out how involved people are with their local communities. We'd like to ask you a few questions. Do you have a minute?
Yes, okay, if it's short.
It won't take long. First, how many of your neighbors' first names do you know?
My neighbors? Oh, lots. Let me see. I'd say about 10, maybe more. I've been in my home for a long time, so I know them all.
Okay. How often do you attend parades or festivals?
Not often. I did when the kids were younger, but now they're not interested. Let's say once a year, maybe even less.
Do you volunteer?
Yeah, we do a lot of fundraising for the local hospital, for arts programs for kids and so on. My wife is very involved in that. We do concerts at Christmas, that kind of thing.
Do you sign petitions?
Sometimes, yes, but not often. I prefer to have more information before I sign things.
do you go to neighborhood meetings?
No, I'm afraid I don't. I know I should, but, it's always easier to do something else.
How often do you visit with friends and family?
Family all the time. My sister lives across the street, so we see her almost every day. I see my dad a couple of times a week. He lives pretty close.
What about friends?
We get together with friends about once a week. We usually go out to dinner.
Hi, we're doing a survey on social involvement, how involved people are with their local communities. Would you mind answering a few questions?
Not at all.
Okay, let's see. First of all, how many of your neighbors' first names do you know?
First names? Let me see. There's Don and Nancy, and Jack and Barbara, and Lourdes, Sammy, Jerry. What's her name across the street? That's about it. How many is that? 7, 8?
7.
There's others that I see pretty often, but I don't know their names.
Okay, that's fine. How often do you attend parades or festivals?
You mean in a year?
Yeah, let's say in 1 year.
Well, we usually go to the Cinco de Mayo festival and the 4th of July parade. Then there's usually a music festival in the park in the summer. I'd say we go to 3 or 4 every year.
Okay, do you volunteer?
Yes, I volunteer at my kids' school. I'm in the PTA. I edit their newspaper, and we help them out with maintenance work on weekends.
Uh-huh.
That's about all we have time for.
Do you sign petitions?
Depends on what they're for. But yes, if I agree with the issue, I'll sign a petition, yes.
What about neighborhood meetings?
Actually, it's funny you should ask that, because I just went to one last night. I went to a meeting about improvements to the park down the street.
How often do you visit with your family?
Well, my parents and my brothers all live far away, so we only get to see them once a year.
How often do you get together with friends?
Oh, I don't know, probably a couple of times a week. Maybe a bit more than that.
We'd just like to ask you a few questions.
Okay.
How many of your neighbors' first names do you know?
Not many, because I just moved to this apartment. There's a guy next door, I think his name is Tom. That's all. I actually never see my neighbors.
How often do you attend parades or festivals?
Rarely. There's a street festival in my neighborhood every summer. I usually go to that because I can't avoid it, but I don't usually go to things like that, no.
Do you volunteer?
No. I give blood at work sometimes, or, I might donate money or something if there's a disaster, but I don't volunteer anywhere. I really don't have time.
Do you sign petitions?
No, I won't sign petitions because I don't know what they're about. I vote. That's how I make my voice heard.
Do you go to neighborhood meetings?
Oh, no.
How often do you visit with friends and family?
Well, I see my mom once a month or so, and my brother, he lives nearby, so I see him on special occasions, Thanksgiving and Christmas, things like that.
What about friends? How often do you see them?
Oh, I'd say almost every night. I go out with friends or with people from work. Hi.
Oh, hi. How's it going?
Bad. What are you doing?
I was just reading the paper while I was waiting.
Is there any interesting news?
Well, yeah. I was reading about some new research on physical fitness. How even little activities like fidgeting can make you fitter.
Fidgeting? Really? So if I tap my foot a lot or move around in my chair, I'll be in better shape?
Yes, seriously, it's apparently true. There was a research study, let me see where it was. Oh yes, it was at the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. Anyway, they found that all kinds of minor everyday activities like standing up to stretch or getting off the sofa to change the TV channel and even fidgeting could make a difference between being thin or being overweight.
Maybe I should throw away the remote.
Well, maybe, because if you have a remote control, it keeps you from moving. They also found that overweight people are less likely to fidget than thin people, and that overweight people spend at least 2 hours more each day just sitting still. And guess what? The extra activity of thinner people might make a difference of something like 10 to 30 pounds in weight per year.
Wow! I better start fidgeting more.
No, you don't have to worry about your weight.
But don't some people just fidget more? Some people seem like they're more nervous than others or something.
Yeah, that's another really interesting point from this research. They think that people may be born with a tendency to either be fidgety or not fidgety.
So either you're born to move around a lot or you're not? Huh, that's kind of discouraging, isn't it?
Well, you'd think so, but the lead researcher for the project says that he doesn't feel it is. He says that the good thing is that you don't necessarily have to go out and run 10 miles. Just any little movement or activity could contribute to physical fitness.
Okay, that's good to remember. I'm curious, does the article explain how they did this research?
Yeah, in fact it does. The people in the study wore special clothes that had sensors in them. The sensors took measurements every half second. There were 20 people in the study, and they wore the special clothes for 24 hours a day for 10 days as they went about their daily routines. They found through the sensors that thin people spent at least 150 more minutes moving in some way than the overweight people.
That's so interesting. Hey, can I read the article?
Of course. Here you go.
Wait, maybe I should stand up and stretch before I read it.
Maybe you should.
Today we're going to talk about the history of money and banking. First of all, does anyone know how people shopped for things they needed before money was invented?
They traded things they had for the things they needed?
Right. One of the oldest types of trading between people was barter. I give you this animal skin, you give me that necklace. That's a straight exchange. But that system isn't always very convenient. Why do you think?
You have to have something that the other guy wants, and he has to have something that you want, and that doesn't always happen.
Exactly. Let's say you have lots of umbrellas and you want to exchange your umbrellas for food. Well, if it's not raining, no one is going to want your umbrellas, so you won't be able to eat because no one wants what you have to trade. On the other hand, if you have umbrellas to sell and it's a rainy day, everyone will want your umbrellas. You'll exchange all your umbrellas for food, but then you'll probably have too much food. See what I mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, what you need in that situation is a common currency. A common currency is something that is valuable for everybody no matter what the season is, and preferably something that will last, that won't spoil. That way you can sell your umbrellas in the rainy season, get currency, and spend that currency later when you need it. Okay, now, what kind of things did people use as currency before they had money? Any ideas?
Beads? Shells?
Jewelry?
Yes, exactly. Decorative objects, shells, beads, teeth, and feathers, they were all common currencies. Just about anything can be a common currency as long as everyone in the community agrees that it has value. The Chinese used metal tools like spades and knives. The Greeks used grain. They used grain in England too. How can you tell? How can you tell that the English used to use grain as money? What is their money called?
Oh, the pound.
Exactly. The English pound used to refer to a pound of grain.
What about coins? When did people start to use coins?
The first coins appeared in about 600 BC in Lydia. That's about where Turkey is today. You also had coins appearing in China at about the same time.
Is that when banks started up too?
Actually, no. Banks came about later. The first banks were actually warehouses or depositories for grain or gold. Let's use gold as an example. People would keep their gold in this place, this warehouse, and they'd get a receipt. The receipt said something like, "You have so much gold on deposit with us." That receipt could then be used to get the gold out of the warehouse. But eventually, when people had to make payments or pay debts or whatever, instead of going all the way to the bank to get the gold, they started to use the receipts instead. Every receipt was connected to a certain amount of gold in the bank. The banknote really meant, if you bring this to the bank, we'll give you this amount of gold anytime you want. And that's how paper money came about.
Wait, isn't it the same now? I mean, don't banknotes represent an amount of gold that the country has? Could you tell us a little more about that?
Ah, yes, that was called the gold standard. That used to be the case, but not anymore. At one time, every dollar represented an equivalent amount of real gold from the U.S. gold supply. But the U.S. left the gold standard in 1971. We don't back our currency with gold anymore.
Can you tell us about that? What is our money backed by now? I mean, where does the value come from?
Nothing. Absolutely nothing backs our money except people's trust in it. What keeps the value of our money up is simply the fact that people believe our money has value. So it does. Any other questions before we move on?
Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Your Money or Your Life. First, we're going to take a look at a movement that is becoming popular in small towns and communities across America, and that is the trend toward local currencies. That's right. Some small towns are issuing their own banknotes that are valid only in the local community. We have a report from Tom in Wilkes, Nebraska. Tom?
Hi there. I'm here in Wilkes, and with me is Adrian Moore from the Chamber of Commerce. Hello, Adrian.
Hi.
Now, I'm holding a beautiful banknote. I just bought this at City Hall. It feels just like a regular dollar bill, but it's blue. And it has a beautiful picture of, I guess this is a lake?
Yes, that's right. It's Lake Washington, about 5 miles from here. It's done by a local artist.
That's interesting. What other kinds of work might an anthropologist do in a corporate setting?
That's right.
What other notes are there?
There's a 1, a 5, and a 10, plus a half hour and a quarter hour.
Okay. So where can I spend this money?
You can use it just about everywhere. All the businesses downtown. Coffee shops, bookstores, department stores. Plus, you can use it for services. Building contractors, painters and decorators, nanny services, artists, you name it.
They'll accept this just as if it was a regular dollar bill or $10?
That's right. The money is legal tender wherever it's accepted.
And how much money is in circulation?
About 20,000 hours so far.
Why did you decide to do this here in Wilkes?
Well, the idea is to stimulate the local economy and to keep money moving around the community. A lot of money was leaving town because people were spending it in chain stores that came from out of state. We wanted to encourage shoppers to shop locally. And if you use your own currency that's different from the dollar, then it's easier for people to see where their money's going.
How many businesses accept these?
More than 300. We publish a newsletter and we list all the businesses that accept the currency.
And what do the businesses do with the money? I mean, can they cash it in or?
Well, they can cash it in, but that's not the objective. What we want to do is keep the currency in the community. Employers use it to pay part of their employees' salaries, or they pay for local services with it. So you see, it recirculates. It goes back into the community that way.
The idea of local currency is not new. Americans have been doing it since before the American Revolution, and it's still popular. Apart from Wilkes, several other communities in the United States have also issued their own currency. There are real dollars in Lawrence, Kansas, Valley dollars in Greenfield, Massachusetts, greenbacks in Brooklyn, and in Canada they have Toronto dollars. I see that on the back of the bills is written, "In Wilkes we trust." It's really about trust in the community, isn't it? When you use these, you're trusting that they'll keep their value and that people will continue to accept them.
I guess so. Yes, we're a very trusting community.
From Wilkes, Nebraska, this is Tom Cohen for WXBC.
When you think of an anthropologist, you probably think of someone who goes off to study a community that is far away and often very remote. That may have been true for anthropologists in the past, but things are changing. Today, while you still may find anthropologists who travel halfway around the world for their work, you might also be surprised to find one working just down the hall in your office. James Wu has a report.
Thanks, Molly. Yes, it's true. More and more anthropologists are being hired to work in the corporate world. It started out as an experiment in a few major companies, but now it's become a big trend. Companies use anthropologists to understand their workers and customers better, and to help design products that work best for their customers. So, how do the anthropologists get this information? With detailed observation, careful interviewing, and clear documentation. In other words, they use the same skills they would use in a remote village in the middle of nowhere. Now, I have Sarah Patton here. She is an anthropologist who has worked in a small Eskimo village up near the Arctic Circle, and she now works for a major telecommunications company. Are they two very different jobs and situations or not? Tell us about it, Sarah.
Of course, there are some differences, but really the way I study people and communities is the same wherever it is. People often don't realize that corporate settings are usually very complex, really pretty much like a small community. I mean that there are all different kinds of people with different opinions and personalities who work or don't work together in different ways.
And what is your job like in a company? What exactly do you do?
Well, it depends on what the company needs at a given time. I've been working on a major project for a few months now, studying how workers interact in the factory. It's very interesting because management tried to bring in a new program to check quality, but it wasn't working very well. We're not finished with the work yet, but I think that a large part of the problem was that management wasn't paying attention to the dynamics of this group. Some workers were upset because they weren't consulted about the change, and then they influenced the other workers who might have accepted this new program more easily. Management had no idea what was going on. They just knew that the new program wasn't accepted.
That's interesting. What other kinds of work might an anthropologist do in a corporate setting?
Let's see. A colleague of mine in another company looks at how people really use technology. I mean, he goes in and observes them in their homes over a few days to see what they really do with technology. I think this is an example of how anthropology can really help business. In the past, people might have just asked people how they used email or cell phones or whatever. Now, when you ask people how they use something, they'll give you an answer, but it may not give a completely accurate picture.
You mean, for example, they might say they use email less than they really do, or something like that?
Yes, exactly. And that's where direct observation can help.
Okay. And then a company could use this information as they improve old products or design new ones.
Yes. They might also look at a certain population. For example, the focus might be on how teenagers use home computers or something like that. And in that case, the anthropologist might spend a lot of time with teenagers.
I think I'd prefer the village near the Arctic Circle. Seriously, this is all very interesting. Do you expect this kind of work to continue to be in demand?
Yes, definitely, I do. I think the business world is only going to get more complex, not less. And as a result, I think companies will continue to need people who are trained to observe carefully. When I started out in anthropology, I never planned to work in the corporate world. But now that I'm here, I expect to be here for a while.
Well, thank you very much for talking to us. Back to you, Molly.
Thanks, James. I guess this means if we see someone with a notebook in the back of the office watching us carefully, we shouldn't worry.
We're continuing our series on career options today. Each week, I've been asking people from different professions to describe their field or job a little. Today, I'm talking to Dr. Julian Tate, an anthropologist. Dr. Tate, I'm wondering if we can begin with an explanation or definition of anthropology. I'm not sure everyone knows exactly what it is. Well, I'm not sure I know.
Don't worry, this is a question I'm asked a lot. Basically, anthropology is the study of humans, and that means humans now in the present or at any time in the past. So really, it's a pretty broad field.
I'll say that does seem broad.
Yes, but the field is typically divided into 4 different areas of study. One is cultural anthropology. This is a study of ways of life, traditions, customs, etc. of different groups of people.
I think that's probably what I imagined anthropology to be about.
Yes, but as I mentioned, there are other areas. There is also physical or biological anthropology, which looks at human origins, genetics, and biological variation. Then another area is archaeology.
Oh, archaeology is considered part of anthropology?
Yes, it generally is. It's the study of humans in the past. So, well, if you think of it that way, you can see how it would fit in.
Yes, I see. And what's the last area of focus?
That's linguistic anthropology. As you can probably guess, this area focuses on language and, of course, the relationship between language and culture.
So there really is quite a lot of range in there.
Yes, there is.
And what's your area of specialty?
Well, I started out in cultural anthropology a long time ago, but then I actually moved into another subcategory in anthropology, music. I study early music in North America.
Oh, really? Music is part of anthropology too?
Yes, if you think about it, music can be an important part of people's everyday life, and it can be very much related to their culture. I actually think that the field of anthropology will continue to broaden and expand. Human life is so rich and varied that it seems logical that there will be more subcategories of study.
Okay. Now, if one or more of our listeners think they might be interested in anthropology, what do you suggest they do?
Well, my suggestion would be to check at the local college or university and see if they have an anthropology program and see what the required classes are. As with any field of study, it's a good idea to take an introductory course to find out if you really are interested in the field. So I'd suggest that. Then I'd also suggest talking to anyone you can find who's in anthropology.
And last question, can you make a good living in anthropology?
Good question. It depends on your specialty and what kind of job you get, but it's pretty unlikely that you'll get rich. However, it's a fascinating field, so that's why I'd recommend it. It's always interesting.
Good morning and welcome to our show. Today we're talking about memory. Our guest is Dr. Phyllis Ray. Dr. Ray has done quite a bit of research on memory and how the brain works. Hello and welcome, Dr. Ray.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Now, I'll confess that I worry about my memory sometimes, and I'm pretty sure that some of our listeners have similar worries. So I hope you can give us some tips.
Well, I think I probably can. One thing that people often don't realize is that feeling anxious or worried about your memory will definitely have a negative impact on your memory. So what I mean is that if you're feeling stressed out because, for example, you always forget people's names, well, the stress of worrying about it will actually make it harder to remember names.
Really? So we should try not to worry about it so much?
Exactly.
Well, we're going to let our listeners get in on this conversation. Let's see what they want to know about memory. First, we have Roberto from Phoenix calling. Hello, Roberto. What's your question?
Hi, you mentioned forgetting people's names. I have a terrible problem with this, so I'm wondering if there are any little tricks that I can use to help me remember.
Yes, there definitely are. With almost any trick or technique, the goal is to make the name you're trying to remember as meaningful and memorable as possible. Try to associate the name with an image. Try to make the image as vivid as possible. For example, if you meet someone named John Hatfield, take a moment and come up with an image. Let's see. I might picture the man standing in a field next to an enormous red hat, and the name John is written in large letters on the hat. You can picture anything that would be helpful, but make it really memorable. Actually, the sillier it is, the better, because you're more likely to remember.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I think having a technique to use will help me feel less worried about this, too.
Good. So that will help with the stress factor we talked about.
Thanks for calling, Roberto. Our next caller is Tim calling from Boston. Hi, Tim.
Hi, this is a great topic.
Thanks.
Good.
My question is about whether we can improve our memory or not. I've been hearing more and more about exercises to strengthen the brain and things like that these days. Well, it's almost like people are saying that we have to work out our brain in a similar way to working out our bodies. Is this true? Should I be trying to exercise my brain?
Great question. And the answer is yes. Research is definitely showing that exercise for our brains is beneficial. And yes, there is a parallel to exercise for our bodies. You can almost think about it as if the brain is a muscle and you have to work it to strengthen it, just the way we do with muscles in our body.
So how do you give your brain a workout?
There are lots of ways. A lot of puzzles, for example. Crossword puzzles are good for your brain. Puzzles that involve pictures and diagrams are also good, and there are actually a lot of good books available now with many different ideas on how to give your brain a workout. I recommend you find a book that looks interesting to you and then do the exercises.
Okay, I will. Thanks.
Thanks for the question.
I'd also like to add that giving the brain some exercise is a good idea as you get older. Age affects the brain just as it affects the body. So regularly working out the brain can help it stay healthy as you age.
That seems like good advice, especially since we're all getting older.
Oh.
Okay, our next caller is Lily from Chicago. Hello, Lily.
Hi. I think my memory is pretty good, but the thing that drives me crazy is when I have something on the tip of my tongue, but I just can't remember it.
The tip of the tongue syndrome. When what you're trying to remember is so close, but you just can't think of it. And the harder you try, the worse it gets, right?
Yes, exactly.
I found the best approach is to talk around the topic. For example, if you're trying to remember the name of a movie, talk about what the story is about, who the characters are, and so on. This gives your brain time to work on it. And very often, if you don't push too hard, it will come back to you.
Thanks.
Okay, it's time for a break. We'll come back in a minute for more of your questions.
Many people worry about memory loss. It's normal to lose memory as you get older. In fact, memory loss can begin when someone is in their 20s. But how much of your memory do you have to lose, and how quickly does it have to happen? Research on the brain and memory is a huge area these days. Doctors are looking for ways to help people improve their memory and possibly prevent loss. Today on the show, we're looking at one program to help memory called the Boot Camp for the Brain. What's the Boot Camp for the Brain? It's a 2-week program developed by a psychiatrist named Gary Small. His program combines 4 elements: a special diet, daily physical activity, stress-relieving exercises, and, of course, memory exercises. The memory exercises take about 15 minutes a day. Dr. Small claims that this combination can improve your brain's function. Michelle Rubin is one of Dr. Small's success stories. Rubin is a 46-year-old mother of 3 teenagers. At the start of the program, her memory tested as average for her age. When she took memory tests after the program, her memory was equal to a 20-year-old person. Rubin says that a few years ago, she started to feel that she was forgetting things and that her memory was not as good as it used to be. She says that the program was life-changing. Since the program, in addition to exercising more and improving her diet, she has started using memory strategies, reading nonfiction, and doing crossword puzzles. She also helps her children with their math homework as a way to work her brain. Dr. Small says that he has evidence that the 2-week boot camp program does, in fact, change the brain. He did a study with 17 volunteers. All of the volunteers had mild memory complaints. Dr. Small randomly chose 8 people to participate in the boot camp for the brain, and the remaining 9 people did nothing different. They did brain scans on all 17 people before and after the program. Dr. Small says that the 8 people who participated developed significantly more efficient brain cell activity in a front part of the brain that controls everyday memory tasks. The people who participated also said that they felt less forgetful after the program. Dr. Small emphasizes that this study was very small and that a larger study is needed. But he still feels that the results are important. Other scientists say they are cautiously optimistic about Small's approach. They feel more research is needed, but say it's possible that the boot camp for the brain could delay serious memory problems. Michelle Rubin and many others who have participated in the program believe that it has definitely helped their memory. So, if you're worried about your memory, the boot camp for the brain might be worth looking into. Tomorrow, we're going to look at some other programs and ideas for improving memory.
Good afternoon. In today's class, we're going to be talking about bees. What do you know about bees?
I don't know. Gives a crap.
Oh, okay, so you think you don't know a lot.
I heard when they sting me.
What? Could you repeat that?
All I know is that it hurts when they sting me.
Yes, it does hurt, and that's what most of us think about when we think about bees. But in fact, bees play an important role in nature. Did you know that bees are mentioned in almost every religion and literature of the world? Imagine. You probably think of bees in warm places, but they actually survive in all kinds of places. The Himalayas and even in the Arctic tundra. So they've been around for a very long time and live in most parts of our world. And there isn't just one kind of bee. Does anyone want to guess how many different species have been named? Yes?
Maybe a few hundred?
No, there are more than that. Any other guesses? No? Okay, there are 22,000 kinds of bees that have been named.
Goodness.
Yes, there are a lot of different kinds, aren't there? Let's talk about the kind of bee that makes honey, the honeybee. Who knows how the honeybee makes honey?
It starts with flowers, right? And they go around to different flowers and take the nectar, but I'm not sure about the rest.
Yes, that's right. A female worker bee goes around to all different flowers and gathers nectar. Then she goes back to the hive. We'll talk about the structure of the hive in a minute. And how is the nectar changed to honey? Anyone? No? Okay. The worker bee passes the nectar on to another bee, and the nectar gets passed from one bee to another. Each bee works with it, and gradually more and more moisture goes out of the nectar. And finally, it's stored on the comb. And over time, more nectar is gathered, more honey made and added to the comb. Now, you know that different honeys have different flavors. If you've never thought about it before, you can probably guess why. The bee picking up the nectar visits a lot of flowers, and each different flower adds a different flavor to the final product of honey.
Excuse me, can you explain how the worker bee carries the nectar back to the hive?
Yes, good question. She carries it in a bag on her stomach, not surprisingly, called the honey sac. When this bag is full, she returns to the hive with all the nectar. Now, let's talk about the structure of the hive. There are 3 kinds of bees in the hive. The female worker bees, as we've talked about, then the male bees, called drones, and then the queen. There could be up to 200,000 worker bees in a hive, but more typically, there are more like 50,000. Then there are only a few hundred drones, and finally, there's only one queen per hive.
How many worker bees did you say?
There can be as many as 200,000, but there's more likely around 50,000. Okay? Next, let's talk about communication among bees. It turns out that bees can communicate to some extent. They can actually let other bees know about the location of food, not just where it is, but how good it is and how much there is. The bees do a kind of dance moving around in the air. It's actually called a waggle dance because of the way they move their bodies. Apparently the size and pattern of this movement is what gives the other bees the information. An Austrian zoologist named Karl von Frisch did experiments to learn about this.
Can you repeat that zoologist's name, please?
Yes, it's Karl von Frisch.
Thank you.
Okay, let's look at some slides.
Hello, everyone. I know many of you have come from far away to visit us here in Cornwall, in England. So, welcome to the Eden Project. To begin, let me give you a bit of background on the project. Our aim is to take horticulture, the science of growing fruits, plants and flowers, and blend it with art, science and education. We also work to find a balance between growing plants for our needs and conserving land worldwide. Overall, our aim is education and not just for people already interested in plants and horticulture. We want to make plant-based issues interesting to the ordinary person. We have 100,000 different plants here and 5,000 different species of plant.
That's amazing.
Yes, it is. Oh, I forgot to mention, feel free to ask questions at any time. Okay, you can see that we have some amazing gardens to walk around in. 3 different areas, in fact, including the 2 biomes. The biomes are the clear domes that you see from here. We'll talk about the different areas, and then you can explore on your own. If you move closer to the map, you'll be able to see better. As you can see, we have 3 different areas with different kinds of plants in each area. One is the outdoor landscape, another is the warm temperate biome, and then the third is the humid tropics biome. Each biome has different sections with different types or categories of plants, whether it be plants for food, plants for use in fiber, clothes and things like that, and so on. There will be signs giving you information on each section. Let's talk about the outdoor landscape first. This has the natural landscapes and plants of temperate regions. This is like our region of Cornwall, like where we are now, and really most of Britain, as well as parts of Russia and parts of North and South America. This landscape will continue to change over time. And, of course, the plants here change with the seasons, too. Oh, it's quite a long walk down to the end of this section, but there is a train that runs from here at the visitor center. Any questions? Okay, let's go on to the warm temperate biome. You can see it here on the map. Think of the regions of the Mediterranean for this one, as well as parts of South Africa, Australia and some of California in the United States. Plants in these regions have to live in difficult conditions, very dry, and usually the soil isn't very good.
So, would these plants include things like olive trees and citrus fruits?
Yes, exactly. Okay, let's talk about the second biome. This is the humid tropics biome. Think of tropical regions such as West Africa, Malaysia and tropical South America. It's actually the largest biome in the world and has over 1,000 plant species in it. And of course the temperatures are pretty warm in there, so bear that in mind.
Can I ask how or where you got all these different plants?
Yes, that's a good question. First of all, they weren't taken from the wild, and most of them are not rare. Many were grown from seed in our nursery here, and others came from botanic gardens or research centers around the world. Also, we consulted with people from the different regions represented here when we got plants. Okay, that's all. Thanks for coming and enjoy exploring the Eden Project. I'll be around for a few minutes if there are any more questions.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. That was great.
Great.
What are you reading?
The Bone Setter's Daughter?
That's an Amy Tan book, isn't it?
Yep.
Oh, I love Amy Tan. Have you read any of her other books?
Yeah, most of them. I've read...
Which one was your favorite?
I don't know. I like them all. This one's pretty good.
The Joy Luck Club was a really important book for me.
That's the one about the mothers and their daughters, isn't it?
Yeah. I read it when I was about 15, and I really identified with it. You know, when I was growing up, I didn't know very many other Chinese Americans, and suddenly here was this book, and it was like the story of my life. Here at last were some characters that I could identify with. It was great. thing is, it actually got me interested in China, really, for the first time. My father was born there, and he still has family over there, but he never really spoke very much about it. And after I read that book, I started to get interested, and I wanted to know more. So suddenly I started asking my parents all these questions, and I wanted to speak more Chinese at home.
Wow.
Yeah, and then we went there on a vacation shortly after that, and it was like I discovered all this family that we had over there. It was so cool.
All because of the Joy Luck Club?
Yes, it was, really, in a way.
Did you see the movie?
Oh yes, I did, and I loved the movie too.
I felt like that with The Catcher in the Rye.
Really?
Yeah. I know it's a really typical teenage book that everybody has to read in high school, but it was a bit like what you felt. You know, you feel that no one understands you, and suddenly you read a book that just describes exactly your experience. The kid in the story, what's his name?
Holden Caulfield.
Holden Caulfield, that's right. He was always going on about other people being phony because adults just seem so, what's the word, so insincere and kind of like dishonest or something to him. That's really how you feel at that age, I think. At least that's how I felt.
Did you read it in high school?
Yeah, and I remember it was the first time I ever liked a book that I had to read for school. After that, I actually got interested in English classes.
The first book that I remember was Treasure Island.
Treasure Island? Really?
Yeah, when I was little, we'd go to visit my grandparents in Brooklyn on Sundays, every Sunday. And the adults would have a big lunch and talk, and I'd be really bored. But they had a lot of books, so one day I started to look through the books, and I noticed Treasure Island because it had these great pictures of pirates and ships and desert islands. The illustrations were beautiful.
Yeah.
And then I started to read the story, and I was hooked. And after that, I'd pull out that book every Sunday and read it. It must have been at least a year. When I was done, I just started all over again because it was quite difficult, so a year later I understood a lot more. I can still see some of those pictures.
I've never read
It just really appealed to my imagination. For years after that, I used to play pirates and look for buried treasure. That was all I wanted to do.
That's why books are so great for kids. They open up a whole world of possibilities to you.
Good morning. The topic for today is literacy and young people. Statistics show that a love of reading has a big influence on children's academic success. The top 2% of students in the country read for 65 minutes a day. The top 10% read for 20 minutes a day. In contrast, the bottom 10% read for 1/10 of a minute per day. That's basically not at all. Now, the best way to improve students' reading is to get them to read more. But teachers will tell you that motivating children to read can be difficult when they prefer to watch television or listen to music. Today, we're going to learn about an organization that uses music to get students interested in reading. And here to talk about it is Gwyneth Dunn. Welcome to the studio.
Thank you.
Tell us about Artists for Literacy.
Well, we collect songs that have been inspired by literature. For example, a song that's been written about a character or a situation in a book. And then we make the song available to teachers. There are a lot of popular songs that have been inspired in one way or another by literature.
Oh, like the Beatles wrote I Am the Walrus. Wasn't that inspired by a poem by Lewis Carroll?
Yes, it was. But also U2, Metallica, Sting, they all wrote songs that were inspired by a novel or a story or a poem they had read. So we compile CDs of songs inspired by literature, and the artists donate the songs. So, for example, we've got Suzanne Vega's song Calypso. That was inspired by Homer's Odyssey. Bruce Springsteen's song The Ghost of Tom Joad, that was inspired by a Steinbeck novel.
And teachers use the music in the classroom. I guess you're looking at, what, middle school, high school?
Both. Both middle and high school teachers use them. Teachers in adult literacy programs use them too, actually.
What do the teachers do with the CDs? How do they use the songs?
They play the songs and they study the lyrics. And that gives the students an idea of the plot or the story or the characters that are in the book. Sometimes there's a video they can watch. And, we have interviews with the artists, too, on our website. It all helps to get students interested and then they're more ready to read the book.
That sounds great. I guess reading is scary to a lot of kids, but music isn't.
Yeah. Oh, we also did a project where students read a novel. Then they wrote and performed their own songs about the story. So it works the other way around, too.
How did this organization come about?
Well, the founder of the organization, Deborah Partis, wrote a song that was inspired by the book Angela's Ashes. And she performed the song on the radio. And after the performance, the radio station got a lot of emails from listeners asking about the book. So she realized that listening to the song got people interested in reading the book.
That's an inspiring story, Gwyneth. Thank you for being with us today.
You're welcome.
For more information about Artists for Literacy, go to their website at...
Today, I'm going to talk about gesture and how we use our hands when we talk. Most of what I'm going to say is based on research done by Professor Susan Golden Meadow. She's written about her work in a book called Hearing Gesture, How Our Hands Help Us Think. It's on your book list. Now, Professor Golden Meadow has spent a long time studying gestures. And by that I mean the kind of small, little hand and eye movements that we use when we talk. We usually don't even notice how we're using our hands when we talk, but try talking without hands. Our hands and our eyes and even how we move our bodies, they all help us to communicate. Okay. The first point I'd like to make is that everybody gestures, including even people who have been blind from birth. So even someone who has never seen a gesture will use their hands when they're speaking. So scientists have concluded that gesturing is not something that we learn from other people. It's something that we do naturally and that we're all born with. Now, gestures usually support what we're saying. For example, I might say, "I'm going upstairs," and I might point upwards with my hands at the same time. And when we talk to each other, we're paying attention to gestures as well, even though we don't normally realize it. Actually, sometimes the gestures give us extra information. For example, if I say to you something like, "Professor Clark is in her office," and I point down as I say it, you will automatically understand she's in her office and her office is downstairs. In fact, you will probably think that I said she's downstairs, where I never actually said that. I just said it with my hands. But you saw the gesture, so you think you heard it. So usually there's a correspondence or a match between the gestures a person makes and what they say in words. The words and the hand movements go together, but sometimes people use a gesture that doesn't match their words. That's called a mismatch. And that's very interesting because it can show you when someone doesn't understand. Professor Golden Meadow worked with children trying to do mathematical problems, and she asked them to explain how they worked out the answer. And she watched their hands. She noticed that sometimes the hand movements would be different from what the child was saying. And she figured that indicated where the child was confused. It can tell you a lot about what's going on in their heads. Professor Golden Meadow believes that we actually use our hands to help us think and to help us put things into words. I'm sure you've noticed that people use more gestures when they have difficulty with language. For example, when they're speaking a foreign language, or when they're explaining something complicated, or when they're describing a painting, or something like that. So it seems that gestures are an important step between thinking and speaking, like a kind of bridge between ideas and words. So let's summarize what I've said so far. Firstly, everybody makes gestures. It seems to be an ability that we're born with. Second, gestures usually correspond to language. The gestures go with what a person is saying. When gestures don't match the language, that can indicate that someone is still working out a concept. And finally, It seems that people actually use gestures to help them think. Okay. Any questions so far?
Good morning and welcome to the show. Today's topic should be interesting to anyone who has ever had to deal with a screaming and frustrated toddler. Most children start to speak somewhere around the age of 2, but they often want to communicate well before that. So, some parents are trying a new way to help their small children communicate earlier, using sign language. I'm watching a baby sign language class at Parents' Corner in Lower Manhattan, and I'm talking to Joan Lee, who's the director of the program. Joan, good morning.
Good morning.
So, these babies are learning sign language?
Well, we're not exactly teaching the babies. We're teaching the parents some basic signs that they can use with their babies.
What kind of signs are you teaching them?
Well, we start with signs for the most important things in babies' lives. Signs for things like more, milk, up, that kind of thing.
The things babies need to say.
Yes, exactly.
Where did the signs come from? Did you make them up?
Oh, no. Most of the signs are taken from ASL, American Sign Language.
How old are the babies?
The youngest is 4 months, and the oldest is about 18 months.
That's incredible. Now, what are the advantages of doing this?
Well, mainly, it's much easier for the parents. And actually for the babies, too, if they can communicate. You can figure out what they want. It's very frustrating when your child is screaming his head off and you don't know what he wants.
I see. Where did this idea come from?
From watching deaf children. Some years ago, researchers noticed that deaf children learn to use hand signals earlier, much earlier than hearing children learn to speak. So they wondered if all children could use hand signals before using words. And it seems that they can.
Now, that raises another question, though. How do children move into speaking from this? I mean, isn't there a danger that they get so good at sign language that they don't speak?
No. Actually, the opposite seems to be true. Signing, using hand signals, may actually help children develop language earlier.
That's interesting.
There's also some evidence that it raises children's intelligence. There was one test done where babies that signed scored 12 points higher on an IQ test than babies that didn't.
That's fascinating. If you would like to find out some more information about using sign language with babies, log on to our website at...
Let's turn now to our book reviewer, Gordon Park. Each week, Gordon gives us suggestions for good reading about health and well-being. What are you going to tell us about this week, Gordon?
Hi, Kelly. I want to talk about a book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers by Robert Sapolsky. I'll explain the title in a minute, but the book is about stress. And, well, I think stress is a topic that most of us are concerned about.
Oh, yes, definitely. So what does the author say about it?
Well, basically that there are two different kinds of stress. One kind is worse for you than the other, and guess which kind of stress most people experience?
The bad kind?
Of course. Now, the author came to his conclusions about stress as a result of working with animals. Sapolsky is a professor of biology and neurology who has spent about 20 years studying primates in Africa, specifically baboons.
Baboons are a kind of monkey, right?
Yes, that's right. So Sapolsky studied stress in animals, and then he made some parallels to stress in humans. And that's what this book is about.
Interesting. First, tell us about stress in animals.
Okay, remember, the title of the book is Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. Now, it's interesting because zebras might feel stress because they are being hunted by another animal.
Obviously, that's stressful.
Yes, but the interesting thing is that this kind of stress is very immediate. It's about living or dying within the next few minutes. It's not about what's going to happen in the next few weeks, months, or years.
Uh-huh.
But Sapolsky compares this type of stress that a zebra might experience to the baboon situation, and it's different. Baboons only need to spend about 4 hours a day searching for food. So Sapolsky argues that this gives baboons a lot of free time to worry and get stressed about things beyond immediate needs and survival. So you can see that this is a different kind of stress.
Yes. So our stress is more like the baboons?
Exactly. A lot of our stress doesn't come from things that are essential for our immediate survival. Usually it's more long-term issues like money and job worries. Our stress is much less often about whether we're going to live or die in the next minute.
Okay, but why is this more of a problem than a zebra's stress about the next 2 minutes?
Well, Sapolsky points out that it is important for your body to react to an immediate crisis. You know, if you had to run from danger, adrenaline and stress hormones could save your life. The problem comes if that reaction never gets turned off. So if you're worrying about long-term problems, that means your body could feel like it's in an emergency state for a long period of time. Over time, this kind of chronic stress weakens the immune system, increases the risk of heart disease, and makes depression more likely.
I see. So, can we do anything about this?
The author seems to think so. Some of the strategies are ones that you may have heard about before. For example, exercise and having a good social support system with friends and family. It's interesting, though. He points out that you need to choose a strategy that works for you. For example, if you really dislike exercise, then it probably wouldn't be a good idea to try that to relieve stress, because doing something you don't enjoy could cause more stress.
I like this idea. It sounds like you would recommend this book.
Yes, definitely. It gives a lot of interesting and useful information about stress. But the best part is that the information is presented in a clear, entertaining, and often humorous way. You can learn a lot from it, but it's not boring.
Okay, another good book to add to our reading list. Thanks, Gordon.